Welcome back, listener. Tonight, we're drifting slowly through the complete history of Fazbear Entertainment, the corporation behind Five Nights at Freddy's, the company that began with dreams of animatronic entertainment and ended in nightmares of murder and haunting, the business entity that built restaurants where children celebrated birthdays and died in back rooms, where animatronics performed and became possessed, where profit mattered more than safety, where cover-ups replaced accountability, where every decision prioritized money over human life, creating legacy not of joy but of tragedy, not of entertainment but of horror. The corporation itself being as much antagonist as any individual character, being the structure that enabled William Afton's crimes, that facilitated the murders, that covered up the incidents, that continued operating despite knowing their restaurants were death traps, that chose profit over protection repeatedly, systematically, creating the nightmare that FNAF depicts through decades of corporate negligence, criminal conspiracy, and complete moral bankruptcy. This is a complete exploration of Fazbear Entertainment as corporation, as business entity, as the system behind FNAF's horror, from the founding partnership between Henry Emily and William Afton through the golden age of Fredbear's Family Diner and Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, through the missing children incident, and subsequent cover-ups through the decades of scandals and closures and rebranding attempts through the modern era of Fazbear Entertainment LLC and the Pizzaplex. Examining how a children's entertainment company became synonymous with death, how corporate structure enabled atrocity, how business decisions led to tragedy, how entertainment became horror through systematic failures of responsibility, safety, ethics, and basic human decency. The corporation being not just backdrop but active participant in FNAF's darkness, being the entity that allowed everything to happen, that profited from suffering, that continued operating despite body count, that represents how systems can be evil even when composed of individuals who might not be. How corporate structures can enable and perpetuate horror through simple mechanics of profit-seeking and liability-avoiding and truth-concealing. Whether you're discovering Fazbear Entertainment's full scope for the first time, letting familiar corporate malfeasance guide you toward rest, or simply allowing the exploration to wash over you as consciousness fades, this will carry you through the complete corporate history, every location, every incident, every cover-up, every decision that prioritized profit over safety, every choice that led to death, every moment where the corporation chose wrong, chose money, chose concealment, chose to continue operating restaurants that killed children, that housed possessed animatronics, that were fundamentally unsafe, the pattern repeating across decades, across locations, across different management teams and corporate structures, the evil being not individual but systemic, being corporate rather than personal, being Fazbear Entertainment itself as entity, as system, as machine for generating profit regardless of human cost. Before we begin our journey through this corporate nightmare, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy these deep examinations that unfold like dark dreams. And let me know in the comments what you think about corporate responsibility in FNAF's universe. Whether Fazbear Entertainment is as culpable as William Afton. Whether system blame matters as much as individual blame. It's always fascinating to see different perspectives on how responsibility distributes in complex situations involving both individual actors and corporate structures. Let's begin this exploration of Fazbear Entertainment, understanding that we start not with a monolithic evil corporation, but with a partnership, with two men who shared a dream of creating animatronic entertainment, Henry Emily and William Afton, one being genuine creator who wanted to bring joy to children, the other being monster, who would use the business as cover for murder, but both being founders, both being responsible for creating the corporate structure that would eventually facilitate tragedy, that would enable horror, that would become Fazbear Entertainment, the company that built restaurants where children died, where animatronics became haunted, where entertainment became nightmare, where profit became more important than human life, where corporate interest trumped every other consideration, creating the system that would define FNAF's universe, that would enable its horror, that would be as responsible for the tragedy as any individual killer, the corporation itself being guilty, being culpable, being murderer through negligence, through cover-up, through choosing to operate despite knowing the danger, despite understanding that their restaurants killed people, that their animatronics were possessed, that children had died and would die again if operations continued, and choosing to continue anyway, to prioritize profit, to conceal truth, to be Fazbear Entertainment, to be the corporate nightmare that underlies FNAF's horror. Part 1. The Foundation. Fredbear's Family, Diner, and Early Success, 1973-1983. As we begin this journey, as sleep starts to pull you deeper, let us travel back to 1973, to Hurricane, Utah, to a small family diner where two men with very different motivations partnered to create something that seemed innocent, seemed wholesome, seemed like simple children's entertainment business. Fredbear's Family Diner being the beginning, being the foundation upon which Fazbear Entertainment would be built, being the prototype that proved animatronic entertainment could be profitable, could attract families, could generate revenue through combination of food service and mechanical performers. The concept being novel for the era, being innovative, being exactly the kind of idea that could build empire, that could expand from single location to franchise, that could make its founders wealthy, and for a time, for those early years, it worked. It succeeded. It was what it appeared to be. Just family restaurant with animatronic entertainers. Nothing darker, nothing sinister, just business operating legitimately, serving customers, entertaining children, making money. The dream working exactly as Henry Emily envisioned it, exactly as it should work if profit and joy could align, if business could serve both owners and customers, if entertainment could be both successful and wholesome. The partnership, Henry Emily and William Afton. Henry Emily was the creator, the engineer, the genuine talent behind the animatronics, the man who designed Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, who understood robotics and programming and performance, who wanted to create entertainment that would delight children, who believed in the project not just as business but as calling, as artistic expression, as way to bring joy through mechanical performance. His motivations being pure, being authentic, being exactly what they appeared to be. Henry being the good one in this partnership, being the one who actually cared about entertainment, about children, about creating something meaningful and positive. his tragedy being that he partnered with William Afton, that he brought Monster into his business, that he enabled through innocent cooperation the crimes that would follow, that he gave Afton access to restaurants, to children, to opportunities for murder, none of it being intentional, all of it being accidental, Henry being guilty only of trusting wrong person, of failing to see what Afton was, of building system that could be corrupted even though he built it with good intentions. William Afton was the businessman, the co-owner, the partner who handled operations and expansion while Henry focused on creation. And, from the outside, this division of labor made sense, seemed reasonable, seemed like natural partnership between creative genius and business manager. But Afton's interest in the business was never purely commercial, never solely about profit, being instead about access, about opportunity, about having legitimate cover for illegitimate purposes, about owning restaurants where children gathered, where he could interact with them, where he could eventually lure them to back rooms and murder them. His business participation being mask, being facade, being way to position himself for crimes he was planning or would plan. His involvement from the beginning being corrupted, being twisted, being motivated by purposes that had nothing to do with entertainment or profit, but rather with access to victims, with creating infrastructure for murder, with building the system he would later exploit when he murdered the children, when he used the restaurant's animatronic suits to hide bodies, when he leveraged the business structure to cover his crimes, to avoid prosecution, to continue operating despite being Monster, being Killer, being William Afton, the child murderer disguised as William Afton, the business owner. Fredbear's Family Diner, the original location. Fredbear's Family Diner opened in 1973. A small restaurant featuring two animatronic performers, Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, both being Springlock suits, hybrid designs that could function as animatronics during automated performance or be worn by human performers for flexibility, the technology being Henry's innovation, being his particular genius, creating suits that were both costume and robot, both wearable and autonomous, the Springlock mechanism allowing switching between modes, though the system was dangerous, was prone to failure. The spring locks being triggered by moisture or sudden movements, causing the suit to clamp down on anyone wearing it, crushing them, killing them violently. The danger being known, being documented, but being accepted because the versatility was valuable. Because Springlock suits allowed small business to create varied entertainment with limited animatronics. One performer being able to wear Spring Bonnie suit one day and let it perform automatically the next, the efficiency justifying the risk in corporate calculation that would become characteristic of Fazbear Entertainment, prioritizing utility over safety, accepting danger as cost of operation. The diner was successful, attracted families, became popular in Hurricane, children loving Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, parents appreciating the entertainment that made dining easier, made celebrations special, made birthdays memorable, the business model working exactly as intended, generating revenue through food sales and party bookings, becoming profitable enough to consider expansion, to think about opening additional locations, to envision growing from single diner to small chain, Henry's dream of spreading his creations, finding economic justification, Afton's interest in expansion finding business rationalization, both partners seeing success and wanting to scale it, to replicate it, to build empire from this single successful diner, not knowing or not caring that expansion would create more locations for tragedy, more restaurants where children would die, more infrastructure for Afton's eventual crimes, the success containing seeds of horror, the business achievement enabling future atrocity. Though in 1973, in the early days, none of that was visible, was predictable, was anything except dream of two men building entertainment business, creating something from nothing, succeeding at capitalism, the American dream working exactly as advertised, at least on the surface. The expansion, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, emerges. By the early 1980s, Fredbear's success justified expansion, creating opportunity to open larger locations, to develop new animatronic characters, to evolve from family diner to full-scale pizza restaurant with animatronic entertainment, the concept expanding, becoming Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. New brand featuring new characters, Freddy and Bonnie and Chica and Foxy. Broader cast allowing for more elaborate performances, more varied entertainment, more appeal to children who could have favorite characters, could collect merchandise, could engage with expanded universe of Fazbear Entertainment. The branding being sophisticated, being well executed, being exactly what successful franchise expansion should look like, taking successful concept and scaling it intelligently, maintaining core appeal while adding new elements, creating something bigger without losing what made original successful. Freddy Fazbear's pizza locations were larger than the original diner, featured more animatronics, offered more extensive menus, targeted birthday party market more aggressively, positioned themselves as destination entertainment, rather than just neighborhood diner. The business model evolving, becoming more ambitious, more commercial, more focused on profit maximization. The innocence of small family diner being replaced by corporate efficiency of pizza chain. The shift being subtle but significant, being transition from Henry's dream to commercial enterprise, from personal project to business machine, from creation motivated by joy to operation motivated by profit. Not that profit was new, not that money didn't matter to Fredbears, but the emphasis shifting, the priorities changing, the corporation becoming more corporate, more focused on expansion and revenue and market position, less focused on craft and quality, and the original vision of bringing joy through animatronic entertainment. Multiple Freddy Fazbear's pizza locations opened across the early 1980s, the franchise growing, becoming regionally recognized, becoming successful by all conventional metrics, revenue increasing, customer base expanding, brand recognition growing, Fazbear Entertainment establishing itself as legitimate business, as successful franchise, as going concern that could continue expanding, could eventually go national, could become major player in family entertainment industry. The trajectory being upward, being positive, being everything that business success looks like, the corporate entity thriving, growing, succeeding, not knowing or not caring that its restaurants would soon become crime scenes, that its animatronics would become possessed, that its success was building toward a catastrophic failure, that the larger it grew, the more infrastructure it created for tragedy, the more locations it opened where children could be murdered, where bodies could be hidden, where horror could unfold. The expansion being both business success and preparation for disaster, both achievement and creation of system that would enable atrocity. The Golden Age, success before the fall. The period from Fredbear's opening in 1973 through the early 1980s represented Fazbear Entertainment's golden age, the time when the business was what it appeared to be, when restaurants were relatively safe, when animatronics were just performers, when children came and celebrated and went home alive, when the company's biggest concerns were normal business challenges, competition and costs, and customer satisfaction. Nothing darker, nothing sinister, the corporation being legitimate, being normal, being what family entertainment company should be. This period representing what Fazbear Entertainment could have remained, should have remained, would have remained if not for William Afton's crimes, if not for the murders that would transform everything, that would end the golden age, that would begin the long nightmare of scandals and cover-ups and possessed animatronics, that would make Fazbear Entertainment synonymous with death rather than entertainment, with tragedy rather than joy, with corporate malfeasance rather than successful business. But in the golden age, before all that, the company was succeeding, was growing, was exactly what Henry Emily wanted it to be. Restaurants bringing happiness to children, animatronics performing successfully, business thriving through legitimate commerce, the dream working, the vision realized, success achieved, though it wouldn't last, couldn't last, being built on partnership with Monster, being structured in ways that enabled corruption, being system that would prove vulnerable to Afton's exploitation, to the murders that would come, to the tragedy that would end the golden age and begin the nightmare. Let this beginning settle. As we pause in this early period, as sleep deepens around you, let the foundation of Fazbear Entertainment settle into understanding. The partnership between Henry and Afton, the success of Fredbear's Family Diner, the expansion into Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the golden age when the corporation was legitimate, was successful, was what it appeared to be. Before the murders, before the possession, before everything went wrong, this early period representing both what the company was and what it could have been, the potential for good that existed before Afton's crimes corrupted everything, before corporate decisions prioritized profit over safety, before Fazbear Entertainment became the nightmare corporation that would define FNAF's universe. But that's ahead, that's coming. For now, we rest in the beginning, in the foundation, in the early success, in the time when animatronic entertainment seemed innocent, seemed wholesome, seemed like good business built on good concept, bringing joy while generating profit, serving customers while enriching owners, being everything that American business ideology suggests is possible. Alignment of private interest and public good, of profit and service, of success and ethics, the dream that capitalism promises, realized briefly in Fazbear Entertainment's early years, before reality intruded, before Afton murdered children, before the corporation chose cover-up over accountability, before everything that made Fazbear Entertainment evil. Just success, just growth, just business operating normally, successfully. The calm before the storm, the innocence before the fall, the foundation that would support not temple but tomb, not celebration but crime scene, not dreams but nightmares. Part 2. The Bite of 83 and First Crisis, 1983. As we continue through Fazbear Entertainment's history, as consciousness drifts further toward rest, we arrive at 1983, at the first major incident that would test the corporation, would reveal its character, would demonstrate how it would respond to tragedy, the bite of 83 being pivotal moment, being transition from golden age to troubled period, being the incident that showed Fazbear Entertainment's priorities, showed what the corporation would do when faced with choice between accountability and profit, between truth and concealment, between protecting children and protecting business, the bite being tragedy, being death of child in circumstances that revealed systemic safety failures, revealed corporate negligence, revealed that Fazbear Entertainment's restaurants were dangerous, that their animatronics could kill, that their operations prioritized profit over protection. The incident being wake-up call that the corporation chose to ignore, chose to cover up, chose to minimize rather than address, setting pattern that would repeat, that would define Fazbear Entertainment's response to every subsequent tragedy, every death, every revelation of danger, the pattern being denial, concealment, continuation, choosing to operate despite knowing the risks, despite understanding that children were endangered, despite having clear evidence that their business model killed people. The incident. Fredbear's fatal malfunction. In 1983, at Fredbear's family diner during a birthday party, a child was bitten by the Fredbear animatronic, the animatronic's jaw clamping down on the child's frontal lobe, the injury being catastrophic, being fatal, the child dying either immediately or after days in the hospital, depending on which version of events we follow. But regardless of exact timeline, the result being death, being child killed by Fazbear Entertainment's animatronic, killed during normal operation, killed while a restaurant was functioning as designed, not during malfunction or attack, but during regular performance. The bite happening because older children, teenagers including Michael Afton, picked up the crying child, lifted him to Fredbear's mouth as cruel prank, as bullying that turned fatal when Fredbear's spring-lock jaw activated, when the animatronic bit down, when mechanical force crushed fragile skull, when child's head was destroyed by entertainment animatronic, the tragedy being preventable, being result of multiple failures, failure to supervise children, failure to prevent bullying, failure to design animatronics safely, failure to protect vulnerable child from both human cruelty and mechanical danger. The victim was the crying child, youngest son of William Afton, his death being personal tragedy for Afton family while being corporate crisis for Fazbear Entertainment. The child dying at the company's flagship location, killed by the company's signature animatronic during event that should have been celebration, birthday party becoming death scene. Fredbear's family diner becoming the place where founder's child died, the incident being nightmare scenario for any business, death of child during normal operation being exactly the kind of tragedy that ends companies, that generates lawsuits, that destroys reputations, that should have ended Fazbear Entertainment, should have resulted in closure, in prosecution, in corporate dissolution. The death being serious enough, being public enough, being sympathetic enough that normal business consequences would be severe, would be potentially fatal to the company. The corporate response. First, cover up Fazbear. Entertainment's response to the bite of 83 established pattern that would repeat across subsequent incidents, the corporation choosing to minimize, to conceal, to avoid accountability rather than accepting responsibility, rather than implementing reforms, rather than prioritizing safety over profit. The response being to frame the incident as isolated accident, as unforeseeable tragedy, as something that couldn't have been prevented, that didn't reflect systemic problems, that didn't require fundamental changes to operations. The narrative being constructed to protect the corporation, to limit liability, to allow continued operation despite child's death, despite clear evidence that animatronics were dangerous, that restaurants were inadequately supervised, that the business model had fundamental safety problems. The legal response likely involved settlements, payoffs to the Afton family to prevent lawsuit, to avoid public trial that would reveal details, to keep the incident as quiet as possible. The corporation using money to buy silence, to prevent accountability, to ensure that the death wouldn't generate the kind of public scrutiny that would force changes, that would damage the brand, that would threaten profitability. The settlement being cheaper than reforms, being more convenient than safety improvements, being the economically rational choice if the only consideration is corporate profit. If human life has only instrumental value measured in liability costs, if children matter only as customers or potential plaintiffs, the calculation being purely financial, purely corporate, purely evil in its cold efficiency, in its complete absence of human concern, in its reduction of child's death to line item in accounting ledger, to cost to be minimized, to problem to be managed rather than tragedy to be mourned and prevented from recurring. The operational changes, minimal and ineffective. Following the bite of '83, Fazbear Entertainment implemented some operational changes, restrictions on spring lock suit usage, increased supervision policies, safety protocols that looked meaningful but were minimally effective, being designed more for liability protection than actual safety improvement, being changes that could be pointed to in defense of future lawsuits, that could demonstrate the corporation had responded to the incident, had implemented reforms, had taken steps to prevent recurrence, even though the steps were inadequate, were insufficient, were chosen based on cost rather than effectiveness, being minimal viable response to tragedy, being least the corporation could do while claiming to have done something. Spring lock suits were restricted or retired in some locations, the dangerous hybrid technology being phased out not because it was unsafe, which it was, but because the bite of '83 made the danger legally problematic, made continued use difficult to defend, made the spring locks liability rather than asset. The corporate calculation changing not because human life suddenly mattered, but because the legal risks outweighed the operational benefits. The decision being purely rational from business perspective, purely amoral from human perspective, reflecting how corporations make decisions based on costs and benefits without ethical dimension, without consideration of right and wrong beyond what's legally required or financially advantageous. Fredbear's closure, symbolic sacrifice. Fredbear's Family Diner was closed following the bite of '83, the original location being shuttered, being abandoned, being sacrificed as symbolic response to the tragedy, the corporation closing the site of the incident while keeping other locations operational, the closure being performative, being gesture that seemed meaningful while avoiding actual accountability, being way to demonstrate corporate concern while maintaining profitability, closing one location while keeping franchise operating, the sacrifice being calculated to minimize damage, to contain the incident, to prevent it from contaminating the entire brand, Fredbears being allowed to die so Freddy Fazbear's Pizza could continue, so the corporation could survive, so profit could persist despite tragedy. The closure meant that Fredbear's Family Diner, the original location where Henry Emily's dream began, where the first animatronics performed, where the concept proved viable, became abandoned building, became monument to failure, became reminder of what happened when entertainment animatronics killed children. Though this reminder would be ignored, would be forgotten, the building sitting empty while Freddy Fazbear's Pizza locations continued operating, continued hosting parties, continued exposing children to animatronics that had proven deadly, the business continuing despite the death, despite the closure, despite clear evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with how Fazbear Entertainment operated. The corporation choosing profit over prudence, choosing to continue rather than reform, choosing to maintain operations despite demonstrated danger, the pattern being established, being locked in, being the corporate character revealed by crisis. Fazbear Entertainment being the kind of company that responds to child's death by minimizing, concealing, and continuing to operate, the evil being not dramatic but bureaucratic, not passionate but procedural, not individual but systemic, being corporate evil, being Fazbear Entertainment revealed. William Afton's response, From Father to Monster. The bite of '83 affected William Afton personally, his youngest son dying, his family fracturing, Michael's guilt, the family structure collapsing, and while Afton's response is complex, while his later crimes might be motivated partially by grief or revenge or desire to understand death, the corporate context matters. Fazbear Entertainment continuing to employ him, continuing to trust him with access to children, continuing to let him operate within the business despite his family tragedy, despite his deteriorating mental state, despite what would become obvious signs that he was dangerous, was unstable, was becoming monster. The corporation's failure to recognize or respond to Afton's transformation being part of its culpability, being part of how it enabled his crimes, being corporate negligence that facilitated murder, though this wouldn't become clear until 1985, until the missing children incident, until Afton used Fazbear Entertainment's infrastructure to commit murders, used the restaurants as hunting grounds, used the animatronic suits as hiding places, used his position within the corporation to access victims and avoid suspicion, all of it being enabled by corporate structure that prioritized profit over protection, that failed to screen employees adequately, that allowed dangerous individual to continue operating within system that gave him access to children, to backrooms, to opportunities for murder. Let this crisis rest. As this section concludes, as sleep deepens further, let the bite of '83 and Fazbear Entertainment's response settle over you, understanding that this incident revealed corporate character, showed how the company would respond to tragedy, demonstrated that profit mattered more than safety, that liability management mattered more than accountability, that continuing to operate mattered more than protecting children, the pattern being established that would repeat, that would define Fazbear Entertainment across subsequent decades, across multiple incidents, across mounting evidence that their restaurants were dangerous, that their animatronics killed people, that their business model was fundamentally unsafe. The corporation choosing every time to minimize, to conceal, to continue, never choosing to stop, to reform fundamentally, to prioritize human life over corporate profit, being evil not through active malice but through passive negligence, through systematic prioritization of money over people, through corporate structure that enabled and perpetuated horror, through simple mechanics of profit-seeking and liability-avoiding, being Fazbear Entertainment, being the system that would enable William Afton's murders, that would cover up the missing children incident, that would continue operating possessed restaurants, that would be as responsible as any individual for FNAF's tragedy, the corporation being villain, being murderer through negligence, being guilty of every death that happened in its restaurants, every child who died because Fazbear Entertainment chose profit over protection, chose concealment over truth, chose to be exactly what it revealed itself to be in 1983, choosing to be Fazbear Entertainment, choosing to be evil. Part 3. The Missing Children Incident and Ultimate Cover-Up, 1985. As we move deeper into Fazbear Entertainment's history, as sleep pulls consciousness toward dreams, we arrive at 1985, at the Missing Children Incident, at the event that should have ended the corporation, should have resulted in criminal prosecution, should have destroyed the business completely, but instead became the ultimate demonstration of Fazbear Entertainment's evil. The corporation's response to 5 murdered children revealing not just negligence, but active conspiracy, not just failure to protect, but participation in cover-up, not just corporate malfeasance, but criminal complicity. The Missing Children incident being the moment when Fazbear Entertainment crossed from negligent business into criminal enterprise, from unsafe operation into active concealment of murder, from corporate villain into accomplice to child murder. The response being so comprehensively evil, so systematically wrong, so completely corrupted that it defines the corporation forever, makes Fazbear Entertainment guilty not just of enabling Afton's crimes, but of protecting him afterward, of helping him escape consequences, of choosing to preserve business rather than seek justice, of being accomplice after the fact, being accessory to murder, being corporate entity that aided child killer, that covered his crimes, that allowed him to escape prosecution, all to protect brand, to limit liability, to continue operating, to maintain profit despite 5 dead children, despite bodies hidden in animatronic suits, despite clear evidence that employee had murdered customers, corporate interests trumping every human consideration, every moral imperative, every legal obligation. The murders, 5 children disappear. In 1985, at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, 5 children were murdered by William Afton, lured to backroom during birthday party or normal business hours, killed there, their bodies stuffed into animatronic suits to hide evidence, to dispose of corpses, to conceal the crime. Afton wearing spring Bonnie costume to gain children's trust, to make them follow him, to isolate them where he could murder them without witnesses, without interruption, without discovery. The murders happening on Fazbear Entertainment property, during business hours, using company equipment, company mascot, company facilities, everything about the crime being facilitated by corporate infrastructure, by access Afton had as employee, by layout of restaurants that included backrooms where surveillance didn't reach, by trust that company mascot generated making children willing to follow, by company's failure to supervise adequately, to protect children, to maintain security that would prevent employee from murdering customers, the corporation being complicit through negligence, through structural failure, through creating conditions that enabled murder. The 5 children, Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, according to most interpretations, died violently, died terrified, died because Fazbear Entertainment failed to protect them, failed in fundamental duty of care that any business owes customers, particularly when customers are children, particularly when business markets itself as family-friendly, as safe as appropriate venue for birthday celebrations. The trust being violated, being exploited, being weaponized against victims who believed they were safe, who believed company mascot was friendly, who followed Spring Bonnie because they'd been taught to trust Fazbear Entertainment's characters. The murder being betrayal enabled by corporate branding, by marketing that created trust that Afton exploited, by business model that gave him access to victims. The discovery and initial response. The children's disappearance was noticed, reported, investigated by police, the incident becoming public, becoming scandal, becoming crisis that threatened Fazbear Entertainment's existence. 5 children disappearing from the restaurant being catastrophic from business perspective, being exactly the kind of incident that destroys brands, that generates lawsuits, that triggers regulatory intervention, that should have ended the corporation, the discovery being moment of truth for Fazbear Entertainment, being choice point where the company could cooperate with investigation, could acknowledge failure, could accept responsibility, could do right thing despite cost, or could choose self-preservation, could minimize, could conceal, could protect business interests over seeking justice, over helping find children, over accepting consequences of failure to protect customers. Fazbear Entertainment chose concealment, chose self-preservation, chose to protect business rather than help investigation. The corporate response being to deny, to deflect, to minimize, to present the disappearances as mysterious, as unconnected to restaurant operations, as tragedy that happened near the business rather than because of the business, the narrative being constructed to protect corporation, to limit liability, to avoid responsibility, the response being coordinated, being systematic, being evidence of corporate conspiracy rather than individual failure, being decision made at organizational level to cover up, to conceal, to obstruct justice in service of protecting profit. The bodies hidden in animatronics. The children's bodies were hidden in the animatronic suits. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy becoming tombs, becoming burial sites, the decomposition causing smell, causing fluid leakage, causing obvious evidence that something was wrong with the animatronics, that they contained biological material, that they were corrupted by death. And Fazbear Entertainment noticed, staff reported the smell, the malfunctions, the problems with the animatronics, and the corporation knew, understood, recognized that something was fundamentally wrong, that the animatronics needed to be inspected, examined, opened to determine the cause of malfunction. But inspection would reveal bodies, would prove murder, would implicate the corporation in failure to protect, would generate liability, would threaten business. So the corporation chose not to inspect, chose not to investigate, chose to claim the smell was just mechanical issues, was normal malfunction, was nothing requiring detailed examination. The decision to not open the suits being active conspiracy, being criminal cover-up, being choice to leave children's bodies hidden rather than reveal them and accept consequences. The animatronics continued operating with bodies inside, continued performing at parties, continued being used for entertainment while containing corpses, while the murdered children's remains decomposed inside them. The horror being compounded by continuation, by business operating normally while unknowingly or knowingly using dead bodies as entertainment, the animatronics at parties being literal corpses, being murdered children performing for living children, the grotesque nature of this being lost on customers but being known to corporation, being understood by management who chose to continue operations, who chose to let the shows continue, who chose profit over dignity, over respect for dead, over basic human decency. The possession. Spirits bind to animatronics. The murdered children's spirits didn't pass on, didn't find rest, instead binding to the animatronics that held their bodies, possessing them through remnant, through spiritual mechanisms that FNAF lore establishes, creating haunted animatronics, creating fusion of mechanical and spiritual. The possession making animatronics behave strangely, making them move during off hours, making them aggressive toward adults, particularly toward security guards, particularly toward anyone in uniform that might remind them of their killer who wore costume. The possession creating behaviors that couldn't be explained by programming, that couldn't be understood as mechanical malfunction, that demonstrated something supernatural was happening, that the animatronics were haunted, were possessed, were vehicles for murdered children's consciousness. Fazbear Entertainment noticed the strange behaviors. Staff reported animatronics moving at night, acting aggressively, behaving in ways that programming couldn't explain. And again, the corporation faced choice, could investigate, could acknowledge, could recognize that something impossible was happening that suggested deeper problem, that indicated fundamental wrongness at the location, or could ignore, could minimize, could explain away as mechanical issues, as imagination, as nothing requiring action, and again the corporation chose concealment, chose to continue operating, chose to employ night security guards to watch the possessed animatronics, to survive the attacks, to be endangered by the haunted machines rather than shutting down, rather than investigating properly, rather than acknowledging that their restaurants had become horror shows, had become sites of supernatural activity, had become places where murdered children's spirits attacked living adults, the corporation choosing to manage the haunting rather than address it, to contain rather than investigate, to continue profiting from possessed animatronics rather than seeking truth about why they were possessed. The lawsuit and settlement families of the missing children sued Fazbear Entertainment, alleging negligence, alleging failure to protect, alleging that the corporation was responsible for their children's disappearances, the lawsuits being justified, being appropriate response to children disappearing from business premises, being effort to hold corporation accountable, to get answers, to achieve justice through civil means since criminal prosecution apparently wasn't happening. Afton not being caught, not being charged, the murders remaining officially unsolved despite evidence pointing to him, despite his access to the crime scene, despite his opportunity and means, the investigation apparently failing or being obstructed or being inadequate, resulting in Afton remaining free, remaining unprosecuted, remaining employed by Fazbear Entertainment despite being child murderer, the corporation choosing to keep him on staff, to continue employing him, to give him continued access to children at their restaurants, the decision being incomprehensible unless understood as active conspiracy, as protection of murderer in exchange for his silence, as deal between Afton and corporation where he wouldn't implicate them in negligence if they didn't reveal his crimes, mutual protection creating partnership in evil. Fazbear Entertainment settled the lawsuits, paid money to families to avoid trial, to prevent public examination of evidence, to keep details concealed, to maintain narrative that the disappearances were mysterious, were unsolved, were tragedy but not corporate responsibility. The settlements being large enough to incentivize acceptance, being enough money that families might choose financial compensation over continued pursuit of truth, being cost that corporation could absorb to avoid worse consequences of public trial, of evidence being examined, of their negligence being proven, of the full scope of their failure being revealed, the settlements being hush money, being payment for silence, being corporate strategy for avoiding accountability while minimizing damage to brand, to reputation, to future profitability. The continued operation, business as usual, after the missing children incident, after the murders, after the cover-up, after the settlements, Fazbear Entertainment continued operating, kept restaurants open, kept animatronics performing, kept hosting parties, kept exposing children to danger. The corporation choosing to maintain business operations despite knowing their restaurants were murder sites, despite knowing their animatronics were possessed, despite knowing that children had been murdered and their killer remained unprosecuted, possibly remained employed. The decision to continue being ultimate expression of corporate evil, being choice that prioritized profit over everything, over safety, over justice, over human decency, over children's lives, the corporation being willing to operate murder sites, to employ murderers, to use possessed animatronics, to expose children to danger, all to maintain revenue, to preserve brand, to continue generating profit, being evil so pure, so systematic, so corporate that it transcends individual malice, being structural evil, being system designed to prioritize money over human life, choosing to do so repeatedly, consistently, systematically. Rest in this ultimate evil. As this section concludes, as sleep deepens toward final rest, let the missing children incident and Fazbear Entertainment's response settle over you like heavy darkness, understanding that this revealed the corporation's ultimate character, showed that it would protect child murderer, would cover up deaths of 5 children, would continue operating murder sites, would choose profit over justice every time. The response being so comprehensively evil, so systematically wrong, so completely corrupted that it defines Fazbear Entertainment forever, makes the corporation guilty of crimes beyond negligence, beyond corporate malfeasance, into territory of criminal conspiracy, of accessory to murder, of ongoing danger to public. The corporation being enemy of children despite marketing itself as family entertainment, being threat despite presenting as safe, being evil despite claiming innocence, the missing children incident revealing truth that would persist across decades, across multiple additional incidents, across continued operations that endangered more children, killed more people, the corporation never choosing to stop, never choosing to prioritize safety, never choosing to be anything other than what it revealed itself to be in 1985, choosing to be Fazbear Entertainment, choosing to be corporate monster, choosing to enable and protect and profit from murder, choosing evil, systematically, structurally, repeatedly, being the villain that FNAF depicts not through individual character, but through corporate entity, through business that chose wrong every time, that prioritized profit over human life every time, that was and remains guilty of everything that happened in its restaurants, every death, every disappearance, every tragedy enabled by corporate structure that valued money over children. Part 4. Decline and Scandals, 1987–1993, continuing through the corporate decline period. As we move through the late 1980s and early 1990s, as sleep carries you deeper into dreams, Fazbear Entertainment entered a period of decline. The corporation suffering from accumulating scandals, from the bite of 87 adding to the bite of 83, from the missing children incident damaging the brand despite cover-up efforts, from mounting evidence that their restaurants were dangerous, that their animatronics killed people, that Fazbear Entertainment was fundamentally unsafe, the business suffering consequences that should have been fatal, that would have destroyed normal company. But Fazbear Entertainment persisted, continued operating through combination of legal maneuvering, rebranding efforts, and sheer corporate determination to maintain profit despite catastrophic failures. The decline being slow rather than sudden, being managed deterioration rather than collapse, the corporation demonstrating remarkable resilience or remarkable depravity, depending on perspective, ability to survive scandals being either testament to corporate competence or evidence of systemic corruption that allowed child-murdering entertainment company to continue operating, despite body count that should have ended it, despite evidence that would have destroyed normal business. Fazbear Entertainment not being normal business, being something darker, being corporate entity willing to do anything to survive, to maintain operations, to keep generating revenue regardless of human cost. The bite of 87, history repeats. In 1987, another animatronic bite occurred, another child or employee having their frontal lobe bitten, suffering severe injury, surviving but being permanently damaged, the incident being second major bite in company history, demonstrating that the problems that caused the bite of 83 hadn't been addressed, that safety improvements were inadequate, that Fazbear Entertainment remained dangerous to customers and employees. The repetition proving that corporate response to first bite was performative rather than substantive, that the company hadn't actually fixed the problems, hadn't actually made their animatronics safe, hadn't actually prioritized protection over profit, the second bite being inevitable result of continuing unsafe operations, being predictable consequence of choosing minimal response over fundamental reform, being proof that Fazbear Entertainment learned nothing, changed nothing, being same dangerous corporation after bite of 83 as before it, just better at covering up, better at minimizing, better at avoiding consequences while maintaining the conditions that caused tragedy. The bite of 87 led to new restrictions on animatronic operations, daytime movement being prohibited, animatronics being required to remain stationary during business hours, the restrictions being corporate response similar to post-83 changes, minimal, reactive, addressing symptom rather than cause, being cheap fix rather than fundamental reform, being change that could be implemented without major cost, without reconsidering business model, without questioning whether animatronic entertainment was viable, given repeated evidence that it resulted in people being bitten, being injured, being killed, the corporation choosing again to minimize response, to do least necessary to continue operations, to change surface behaviors without addressing underlying problems, being Fazbear Entertainment being consistent, being predictable, being exactly what it had shown itself to be. Company that responds to tragedy with minimal viable changes, that prioritizes cost over safety, that continues operating despite demonstrated danger. The financial strain, lawsuits and lost revenue. Through the late 1980s and early 1990s, Fazbear Entertainment faced financial pressure from multiple sources, lawsuits from incident victims and victims' families. Declining customer base as parents became reluctant to bring children to restaurants with reputation for danger. Regulatory scrutiny increasing costs. Insurance premiums skyrocketing. The accumulated costs of operating dangerous business catching up with the corporation. Threatening profitability, threatening viability, forcing difficult choices about whether to continue operations, whether to close locations, whether to declare bankruptcy and dissolve the corporation. The financial pressure being consequences of corporate decisions, being cost of prioritizing profit over safety, being price of covering up murders and operating possessed restaurants, the corporation having avoided immediate accountability but being unable to escape economic consequences forever. The market eventually punishing Fazbear Entertainment for being dangerous, for being scandal-ridden, for being company that killed children. The corporation responded with cost-cutting, reducing maintenance budgets, reducing staffing, reducing safety expenditures, the budget cuts being exactly wrong response, being choices that made dangerous situation more dangerous, that increased risk to customers and employees, that prioritized short-term financial survival over long-term viability, over human safety, over anything except immediate profit, the cost-cutting creating conditions visible in FNAF 1, the location in 1993 being understaffed, being poorly maintained, being obviously deteriorating, animatronics being broken, facilities being degraded, the restaurant being shadow of what Fazbear Entertainment once was, being evidence of decline, of corporate death spiral, of business that couldn't afford to operate safely but chose to operate anyway, chose to cut costs rather than close, chose to endanger people rather than accept business failure, being Fazbear Entertainment to the end, prioritizing profit over people even when profit was minimal, even when business was failing, even when the rational choice would be closure, corporation, choosing to continue, to persist, to maintain operations despite being unable to do so safely, being unable to afford proper maintenance, being fundamentally compromised. The rebranding attempts. New look, same failures. Fazbear Entertainment attempted multiple rebrandings, creating new animatronic lines like the toy animatronics in 1987. Updated designs meant to distance from scandal-plagued older characters, meant to attract customers with newer, cuter, more child-friendly aesthetic. The rebranding being corporate strategy for escaping bad reputation, for starting fresh, for making people forget or overlook the incidents, the murders, the bites, the accumulated evidence that Fazbear Entertainment was dangerous, the new animatronics being marketing rather than safety improvement, being cosmetic rather than substantive, being effort to change perception without changing reality, without addressing underlying problems, without making operations actually safer, just making them appear safer, seem more modern, feel less connected to tragic past. The toy animatronics featured updated technology, facial recognition connected to criminal database, supposed safety improvement that would prevent people like William Afton from accessing restaurants, from approaching children, the technology being marketed as safety feature, as evidence that Fazbear Entertainment had learned, had improved, had made their restaurants safer, but the technology was inadequate, was limited, was performative like all their safety measures, being gesture toward protection without actual effectiveness, being feature that could be advertised without actually preventing future incidents, being typical Fazbear Entertainment response, minimal viable improvement that could be marketed as major change, that could be used to distract from continued fundamental problems. The toy animatronics also became possessed, also exhibited supernatural behaviors, also attacked night guards, demonstrating that new animatronics didn't solve the possession problem, didn't address the spiritual contamination of Fazbear Entertainment's locations, didn't prevent murdered children's spirits from affecting operations, the possession transferring to new animatronics or new spirits binding to them, or the locations themselves being haunted. Independent of specific animatronics, regardless of mechanism, the result being that rebranding failed. New animatronics were as dangerous as old ones. Fazbear Entertainment remained unsafe despite cosmetic changes, despite new designs, despite marketing claiming improvement, the corporation being unable to escape its past, unable to operate without supernatural complications, unable to be safe because safety had never been priority, had never been goal, had never been anything except marketing claim without substance. The location closures, consolidation and survival. Through the early 1990s, Fazbear Entertainment closed multiple locations, consolidating operations, retreating from the expansion of the early 1980s, the closures being forced by financial pressure, by inability to maintain multiple restaurants profitably, by declining customer base making some locations unviable, the contraction being managed decline, being strategic retreat, being effort to survive by becoming smaller, by reducing operational costs, by concentrating resources at fewer locations, the corporation choosing survival over growth, choosing to maintain some presence rather than expand or dissolve completely, being remarkable persistence, being refusal to accept defeat, being determination to continue operating despite catastrophic failures, despite financial pressure, despite rational analysis suggesting that Fazbear Entertainment should end, should close, should accept that the business model was fundamentally flawed, the corporation refusing, persisting, consolidating, surviving through determination and legal maneuvering and willingness to operate at minimal level, being unwilling or unable to simply stop, to admit failure, to close permanently. The final location by 1993, the location where FNAF 1 takes place, represented Fazbear Entertainment at its lowest point. Single restaurant, poorly maintained, clearly dying, operating with minimal staff, minimal budget, minimal hope of long-term survival, but still operating, still hosting parties, still using possessed animatronics, still exposing children to danger. The corporation in its death spiral still choosing to continue, still prioritizing any profit over safety, over children's lives, over basic responsibility, being Fazbear Entertainment in its purest form, stripped of pretense, unable to maintain facade of successful business, clearly failing but refusing to stop, being evil so persistent, so dedicated, so purely committed to profit-seeking that it continued despite being unable to do so safely, despite being unable to do so ethically, despite being unable to do so legally in any jurisdiction with functional oversight, but continuing anyway, being the corporation that would not die, that would not stop, that would not prioritize anything over profit, being Fazbear Entertainment, being the ultimate corporate villain, being evil systematized. Let this decline rest. As this section concludes, as sleep deepens further, let the decline period settle over you. The bite of 87 and financial pressure and rebranding failures and location closures, all demonstrating that Fazbear Entertainment persisted despite catastrophic failures, continued operating despite mounting evidence that the business model was fundamentally unsafe, refused to stop despite rational analysis suggesting closure was appropriate, the corporation's determination to survive being either remarkable resilience or remarkable depravity, being testament either to corporate competence or to systemic corruption, depending on whether you measure success by profit or by human cost. The decline showing that Fazbear Entertainment prioritized survival over safety, prioritized continuation over accountability, prioritized profit over human life, even when profit was minimal, even when survival was questionable, even when operations were clearly unsafe. The pattern being consistent from founding through golden age, through scandal, through decline, the corporation always choosing wrong, always prioritizing business over people, always being Fazbear Entertainment, always being the corporate system that enabled horror, that covered up murder, that operated possessed restaurants, that employed child killers, that endangered children for profit, that was and remains guilty of everything that happened in its locations, being the villain of FNAF as much as any individual character, being the system that enabled and perpetuated tragedy, being evil corporation, being Fazbear Entertainment. Part 5. The Modern Era and Legacy, 2000s to 1920s, continuing through recent history and implications. As we approach the modern era of FNAF's timeline, as sleep claims you completely, we must examine how Fazbear Entertainment persisted beyond what should have been its death, how the corporation survived into the 21st century through legal restructuring, through franchise licensing, through selling its intellectual property and brand to others who attempted to profit from the notorious history, from the murders and hauntings and scandals that made Fazbear Entertainment famous in darkest way. The modern era being characterized by attempts to profit from horror, to monetize tragedy, to turn corporate history of child murder into entertainment property, horror attraction, nostalgia product, the dissolution of original corporate structure, not ending the brand, not stopping operations, but rather transforming them, dispersing responsibility while maintaining profit potential. Fazbear Entertainment becoming not a single corporation, but network of license holders and franchise operators and horror entrepreneurs, all profiting from the murders, from the possessed animatronics, from the tragedy that the original corporation caused and covered up. The modern era being testament to capitalism's ability to monetize anything, to turn any tragedy into profit opportunity, to make horror entertaining, to transform real deaths into fictional thrills, being ultimate expression of corporate evil, turning children's murders into entertainment, making money from tragedy, being Fazbear. Entertainment in its final form, no longer even pretending to be legitimate entertainment company, being instead horror brand, being intellectual property built on child murder, being franchise built on tragedy, being ultimate corporate depravity. Fazbear Entertainment, LLC, Corporate Restructuring. By the early 2000s, the original Fazbear Entertainment Corporation had dissolved or restructured, the original corporate entity being replaced by Fazbear Entertainment, LLC, new legal structure that claimed to be separate from past crimes, from past negligence, from past corporate malfeasance. The restructuring being legal strategy for avoiding liability, for claiming the new corporation wasn't responsible for old corporation's actions, wasn't guilty of the murders and cover-ups, wasn't liable for the deaths and injuries, being fresh start legally while maintaining brand recognition, keeping the Fazbear Entertainment name and intellectual property while shedding legal responsibility. The strategy being ethically bankrupt, being legal maneuvering to avoid consequences, being continuation of pattern where corporation prioritizes profit and self-preservation over accountability, over justice, over acknowledging responsibility for decades of harm. Fazbear Entertainment, LLC positioned itself as successor interested in honoring the legacy while moving forward. The corporate messaging being carefully crafted to acknowledge past incidents while framing them as tragedy rather than negligence, as mysterious events rather than criminal activity, as unfortunate history rather than systemic corporate failure. The narrative being constructed to maintain brand value while minimizing legal exposure, to keep using Fazbear name and characters while avoiding responsibility for what that name actually represented, what those characters had been used for, what history the brand carried, being corporate strategy that's common, that's legal, that's completely amoral, being way that businesses avoid consequences through restructuring, through legal entity changes, through careful messaging that preserves value while shedding liability. Fazbear's Fright, Monetizing Horror, 2023. In 2023, 30 years after the last Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed, entrepreneurs created Fazbear's Fright Horror Attraction, using salvaged animatronics and memorabilia from original locations, marketing the attraction based on the murders and hauntings, on the tragic history of Fazbear Entertainment, turning corporate crimes into entertainment, making tourist attraction from child murder, profiting explicitly from horror that was real, from deaths that actually happened, from tragedy that destroyed families, the horror attraction being ultimate expression of capitalism's amorality, of ability to monetize anything, to turn any history into product, to make money from suffering if people will pay to experience a sanitized version of it. If horror can be made entertaining, if tragedy can be made thrilling, if real deaths can become fictional frights. Fazbear's Fright represented new phase of Fazbear Entertainment's legacy, no longer pretending to be family restaurant, no longer maintaining facade of wholesome entertainment, being instead explicitly horror-focused, being honest about what Fazbear Entertainment represented, what its history actually was, but making that honesty profitable, making the horror marketable, turning acknowledgement of tragedy into attraction, people paying to experience simulated version of real horror, to be scared by animatronics that actually killed people, to visit location themed around actual child murders, the ethical problems being obvious, being profound, being complete perversion of how tragedy should be remembered, how victims should be honored, how corporate crimes should be treated, instead being monetized, being entertainment, being business opportunity. The horror attraction burned down in 2023, possibly due to supernatural causes, possibly due to remaining spirits or possessed animatronics or the contamination that seemed to follow Fazbear Entertainment's legacy. The destruction being appropriate, being deserved, being universe-rejecting attempt to profit from tragedy, though it wouldn't end the pattern, wouldn't stop future attempts to monetize Fazbear Entertainment's history, to profit from the murders, to make entertainment from horror. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Place, Trap and Ending, 2023. Also, in 2023, another Freddy Fazbear's Pizza opened, this one being different, being trap designed by Henry Emily to gather the possessed animatronics, to lure the spirits, to end the haunting, to finally address what Fazbear Entertainment never addressed, to take responsibility for the horrors that the corporation caused. Henry designing the location not as real business, but as elaborate mechanism for containing and destroying the possessed animatronics, for freeing the children's spirits, for ending the nightmare that began with his partnership with William Afton, that was enabled by corporate structure he helped create, that persisted through decades of corporate malfeasance. Henry finally acted not as businessman, but as moral agent, as person taking responsibility, as someone choosing to end the horror rather than profit from it. The pizzeria being opposite of Fazbear Entertainment's approach, being accountability rather than concealment, being justice rather than profit, being everything the corporation never was. The location burned with the animatronics inside, Henry sacrificing himself, trying to end the cycle, trying to free the spirits, trying to finally give murdered children peace after decades trapped in mechanical bodies, after years of being used by corporation that should have protected them, that instead enabled their murders and then profited from their deaths. Henry's final act being atonement, being acceptance of responsibility that the corporation never accepted, being human response to corporate evil, being individual trying to repair damage that system caused, though whether he succeeded, whether the spirits found peace, whether the horror truly ended is unclear, is debated, is complicated by subsequent FNAF lore suggesting continuation, suggesting that even Henry's sacrifice wasn't sufficient to end what Fazbear Entertainment began. The Mega Pizzaplex, Corporate Resurrection, 2020s. In the 2020s, Fazbear Entertainment returned in new form, the corporation building massive Mega Pizzaplex, modern entertainment, complex with updated animatronics, glam rock versions of classic characters, advanced technology, extensive facilities, the Pizzaplex representing corporate resurrection, representing Fazbear Entertainment surviving everything, surviving the murders and scandals and closures and fires, returning bigger than ever, more technologically advanced, more commercially ambitious, more convinced than ever that animatronic entertainment was viable. Despite decades of evidence proving otherwise, despite body count that should have ended the brand forever, despite history that should have made Fazbear Entertainment name synonymous with danger rather than entertainment. The Pizzaplex demonstrated that Fazbear Entertainment learned nothing, changed nothing, being new iteration of same corporate evil, prioritizing profit over safety, prioritizing technological spectacle over learning from past failures, prioritizing commercial ambition over acknowledging that every previous attempt at this business model ended in tragedy, in death, in horror. The corporation being remarkably consistent, being predictable, being exactly what it had always been. Company that believed problems could be solved through cosmetic changes, through new designs, through better marketing, never understanding or never caring that the fundamental problem was corporate culture, was prioritization of profit over human life, was systematic choice to operate unsafe businesses, to cover up incidents, to prioritize continuation over accountability. Being Fazbear Entertainment in the 2090s, being the same as Fazbear Entertainment in the 1980s. Different branding, same evil, different technology, same priorities, different animatronics, same willingness to endanger children for profit. The Pizzaplex also experienced incidents, also became site of horror, also demonstrated that Fazbear Entertainment remained unsafe, remained corrupted, remained haunted by its past literally and figuratively, the new location being unable to escape the legacy, being unable to operate without supernatural complications, being unable to be safe because safety had never been goal, had never been priority, had never been anything except marketing claim. The pattern repeating, proving that Fazbear Entertainment couldn't be reformed, couldn't learn, couldn't change, could only continue being what it was, being corporate structure that prioritized profit over human life, that operated unsafe businesses, that endangered children, that covered up deaths, being evil systematized, being Fazbear Entertainment, being the corporation that refused to die, that refused to learn, that refused to stop, that persisted across decades, across incidents, across every reason why it should have ended, being remarkably persistent, being terrifyingly resilient, being corporate entity that would not stop, that would always return, that would always prioritize profit, that would always be Fazbear Entertainment. The legal and ethical legacy. Fazbear Entertainment's legacy is one of complete corporate failure, of systematic negligence, of criminal complicity, of evil so bureaucratized, so systematized, so normalized that it persisted across decades, across management changes, across corporate restructurings, the evil being not individual but structural, not passionate but procedural, not dramatic but administrative, being the evil of paperwork, of liability calculations, of cost-benefit analyses that weigh human lives against profit margins and consistently choose profit, being corporate evil in its purest form, being system designed to prioritize shareholder value over everything, over safety, over lives, over children, over justice, over truth, over basic human decency, being capitalism without ethics, being profit-seeking without moral constraint, being Fazbear Entertainment. The corporation's response to every incident followed pattern. Deny, minimize, settle, continue, never stopping operations, never prioritizing safety over profit, never accepting responsibility fully, never being held accountable in ways that changed behavior, the legal system being inadequate to corporate evil of this type, being designed for individual criminals rather than criminal systems, being unable to properly punish corporation that kills children through negligence and cover-up, being too easy to manipulate through restructuring, through bankruptcy, through legal strategies that separate current corporate entity from past corporate crimes, allowing Fazbear Entertainment to persist, to continue, to maintain operations across decades despite body count that would send individual to prison for life, despite crimes that would destroy individual but only damage corporation temporarily. The asymmetry revealing how legal system treats corporate entities differently from human persons, how corporations can commit crimes, avoid full accountability, and continue existing, continue operating, continue profiting. Rest in this complete history. As this section concludes, as sleep deepens toward final understanding, let Fazbear Entertainment's complete history settle over you. From founding partnership through golden age, through scandals, through decline, through modern resurrection, the complete corporate timeline showing pattern of prioritizing profit over human life, of choosing concealment over accountability, of being consistently, systematically, structurally evil across decades, across changes in management and ownership and corporate form, the evil being not incidental but essential, being not bug but feature, being what Fazbear Entertainment was designed to be, corporate structure optimized for profit generation regardless of human cost, being capitalism in its purest, most amoral form, being business operating according to its incentives, its legal obligations to shareholders, its imperative to maximize value, the imperative overriding every human consideration, every moral constraint, every ethical limitation, creating corporation that enabled child murder, that covered up tragedy, that continued endangering children across decades, that persisted despite every reason why it should have ended, being Fazbear Entertainment, being the corporate villain of FNAF, being the system that enabled and perpetuated horror, being as guilty as any individual, being evil systematized, being the machine for generating profit from children's entertainment regardless of whether children died, being the corporation that would not stop, would not learn, would not change, would not prioritize safety, would not accept responsibility, would not be anything except what it was designed to be. Profit-maximizing entity, corporate structure serving shareholders rather than customers, system prioritizing money over human life, being Fazbear Entertainment, being evil. Corporation, being villain as much as any individual character, being guilty, being responsible, being the system behind the horror. Conclusion, corporate evil and final understanding, final synthesis and rest. As we arrive at the end of this exploration, as sleep claims you completely, let us gather all the threads of Fazbear Entertainment's history, understanding the corporation not just as setting or backdrop, but as active participant in FNAF's horror, as villain as significant as William Afton, as system that enabled and perpetuated tragedy across decades, the complete picture showing that Fazbear Entertainment chose wrong every time, prioritized profit over safety every time, chose concealment over accountability every time, being consistently, systematically, structurally evil from founding through modern era, the pattern being unbroken, being clear, being the corporate character revealed through decades of incidents and responses, Fazbear Entertainment being corporation that would do anything for profit, that would enable murder, would cover up deaths, would endanger children, would operate possessed restaurants, would continue despite body count, would persist despite failures, would be exactly what it showed itself to be repeatedly, systematically, predictably, being evil not through passion but through policy, not through individual decision but through corporate structure, being the system that FNAF depicts as responsible for horror as much as any individual killer. The corporate structure as villain Fazbear Entertainment represents a specific type of evil, corporate evil, systematic rather than individual, structural rather than personal, evil that emerges from organizations designed to maximize profit regardless of cost, that prioritize shareholder value over human life, that make decisions through cost-benefit analysis rather than ethical reasoning, that calculate acceptable casualties, acceptable risks, acceptable body counts based on profit margins and liability costs. The corporation being machine for generating revenue, optimization function that treats human life as input rather than purpose, that measures success by financial metrics rather than human flourishing, that exists to serve capital rather than people, being pure expression of capitalist logic without ethical constraint, without moral limitation, without any consideration except profit, being what corporations become when unrestrained by regulation, by oversight, by consequences sufficient to change behavior, by legal system capable of properly punishing corporate crimes, being Fazbear Entertainment as example of corporate evil, as case study in how business can enable atrocity through simple mechanics of profit-seeking and liability avoiding. The structure enabled Afton's crimes by providing access to children, by creating back rooms without surveillance, by failing to screen employees adequately, by prioritizing operational efficiency over security, by making business decisions that facilitated murder even though murder wasn't intended, wasn't desired, being collateral damage of corporate optimization for profit rather than safety. The structure being vulnerable to exploitation by predator like Afton because safety wasn't priority, wasn't goal, wasn't valued highly enough to justify costs of preventing it. The corporate calculation accepting risk of crime as cheaper than security sufficient to prevent it. The decision being rational from profit perspective, being evil from human perspective, being typical Fazbear Entertainment, choosing cheaper option regardless of human cost. The cover-ups as corporate policy. Fazbear Entertainment's response to incidents revealed corporate character more clearly than any mission statement or marketing material. The pattern of denial, minimization, settlement, and continuation being corporate policy rather than individual decision, being systematic rather than arbitrary, being the way Fazbear Entertainment operated across decades, across management changes, across corporate restructurings, the policy being to protect business rather than seek justice, to limit liability rather than accept responsibility, to conceal truth rather than acknowledge failure, being corporate strategy for managing tragedy, for containing damage to brand and profitability, for ensuring that incidents didn't end the business, didn't threaten operations, didn't prioritize human cost over corporate survival, the cover-ups being not aberration, but standard operating procedure, being how Fazbear Entertainment dealt with children dying, with animatronics killing people, with all the horrible consequences of operating unsafe restaurants, being business as usual for a corporation that prioritized profit over everything. The missing children incident response was ultimate demonstration, showing that Fazbear Entertainment would cover up child murder, would protect killer, would continue employing him, would hide bodies, would obstruct justice, would do anything necessary to avoid accountability, to maintain operations, to protect profit. The response being criminal conspiracy, being corporate crime at highest level, being decision made by organization rather than individual, being Fazbear Entertainment revealing its complete moral bankruptcy, its willingness to enable and conceal child murder, if that's what preserving business required, being evil so pure, so systematic, so thoroughly corporate that it transcends individual malice, being structural evil, being a system designed to prioritize profit over human life and doing exactly that, choosing profit when choice was between profit and justice for murdered children, being Fazbear Entertainment, being consistent, being predictable, being exactly what it showed itself to be. The persistence as ultimate horror Fazbear Entertainment's refusal to stop, refusal to close, refusal to accept that the business model was fundamentally flawed, that animatronic entertainment was too dangerous, that the corporation had failed too comprehensively to deserve continuation. This persistence being ultimate horror, being demonstration that systems don't have conscience, don't feel shame, don't learn from failure in ways that humans do, being capable only of optimization for defined goals. If goal is profit, then a system pursues profit regardless of human cost, regardless of body count, regardless of how many incidents prove the business shouldn't exist. The corporation continuing because continuation is what corporations do, being designed to persist, to maximize shareholder value, to operate unless forcibly stopped, to continue until legally compelled to cease, the persistence being not admirable resilience but evidence of system without ethics, without ability to choose right over profitable, without capacity for the kind of moral reckoning that would end operations voluntarily, that would prioritize human life over corporate survival, the persistence being Fazbear Entertainment being corporate entity, being system rather than person, being machine that can't choose to stop, that continues optimizing for profit regardless of whether optimization kills children, being horror of system without conscience, without humanity, without capacity for redemption. The modern era Pizzaplex demonstrates this persistence, shows that Fazbear Entertainment learned nothing, changed nothing, being newest iteration of same corporate evil, being proof that the system can't reform, can't fundamentally change, can only continue being what it's designed to be. Profit-maximizing entity, corporate structure serving shareholders, system prioritizing money over human life, being Fazbear Entertainment in the 2020s, being the same as Fazbear Entertainment in the 1980s. Different branding, same evil, different technology, same priorities, different management, same willingness to endanger people for profit. The persistence being evidence that corporate evil is structural, is systematic, is designed into how businesses operate under capitalism, can't be fixed through individual reforms, through new leadership, through better intentions, being embedded in purpose, in design, in the optimization function that defines what corporation is, what it does, what it prioritizes, being Fazbear Entertainment, being corporate entity, being machine for profit, being system that can't choose human life over shareholder value, being horror that persists, that continues, that will always return because system won't stop itself, can only be stopped by external force, by regulation, by legal consequences, by market abandonment, by anything except internal moral reasoning which corporations can't do, which systems don't have, which Fazbear Entertainment never demonstrated, never would demonstrate, being corporation, being machine, being system designed for profit regardless of cost. Complete understanding and final rest. You've journeyed through Fazbear Entertainment's complete corporate history now, from founding partnership through golden age through scandals and decline through modern resurrection. Understanding the corporation as active villain, as system-enabling horror, as structure prioritizing profit over human life across decades, across incidents, across every opportunity to choose differently, the pattern being consistent, being clear, being Fazbear Entertainment revealed as corporate evil, as business that enabled child murder, that covered up deaths, that continued operating despite body count, that chose profit every time, that was and remains guilty of everything that happened in its restaurants, being responsible for every death, every tragedy, every horror that FNAF depicts, being villain as significant as any individual character, being system as culpable as any person, being corporation that chose evil systematically, structurally, repeatedly, being Fazbear Entertainment, being guilty. And now, with understanding complete, with corporate history fully explored, with the pattern clear, with the evil revealed, you can rest, can sleep deeply, can let all of this settle into dreams, knowing that Fazbear Entertainment's story is told, its character exposed, its crimes documented, the complete corporate timeline mapped from beginning to present, from innocent founding to systematic evil to modern persistence, the journey showing how business can become villain, how corporate structure can enable atrocity, how profit-seeking can prioritize money over human life so completely, so systematically, so thoroughly that corporation becomes evil, becomes guilty, becomes responsible for horror it enabled and perpetuated, being Fazbear Entertainment, being corporate nightmare, being system villain. Gratitude and release to sleep. Thank you for joining this exploration of Fazbear Entertainment, for examining the corporation behind FNAF's horror, for understanding the system that enabled tragedy, the business that prioritized profit over children's lives, the corporate structure that chose wrong every time. This deep examination being designed to reveal how systems can be evil, how businesses can enable atrocity, how corporate priorities can corrupt completely, how Fazbear Entertainment represents a specific type of villain, corporate rather than individual, systematic rather than personal, structural rather than passionate, being evil of a particular kind that's relevant beyond FNAF, that speaks to how capitalism operates, how businesses prioritize, how systems serve purposes that may not align with human good, how corporations can become monstrous through simple mechanics of profit maximization without ethical constraint. Sleep now, completely, finally, deeply, far from corporate boardrooms and liability calculations, far from businesses that endanger children, far from systems that prioritize profit over human life, far from Fazbear Entertainment's history of horror, safe in your world where corporations face regulation, where businesses are held accountable, where children's entertainment companies that killed customers would be shut down, where systems are constrained by law and ethics and consequences that Fazbear Entertainment avoided or circumvented, where corporate evil is limited by external force if not internal conscience, where you can sleep safely knowing that Fazbear Entertainment is fiction, is exaggeration, is horror story rather than documentary, though it contains truth about how systems operate, about how businesses prioritize, about how corporations can enable horror through systematic choices to prioritize profit over people. The truth being sobering, but the specifics being fictional, the extreme being horror rather than reality, allowing rest, allowing sleep, allowing you to drift into dreams far from corporate nightmares, far from Fazbear Entertainment, far from all of it, safe in your bed, protected by distance from fiction, blessed with separation from horror, able to sleep peacefully knowing the exploration is complete. The corporate history is told, the villain is revealed, and you understand, and you can rest. Sleep deeply. Dream peacefully. Rest completely. Fazbear Entertainment's story is told. The corporate nightmare is explored. You're safe. Good night.